Broken Thing. Chapter 8. The plan had been drawn up, and Kegarin was able to go in 6 days after arrival on the Citadel, sufficient time for testing and planning for follow-up of non-emergent medical care dependent on Citadel lab analysis. Thane Krios no longer existed, no longer would exist except in shadows and feints. Although Kegarin would miss certain aspects of Thane Krios, and particularly his Dralafa, the mind of Itran was not an unfamiliar place. Much of Senar's training had been geared toward creating a creature of duty and humility. He had spent more time being someone of Itran's presentation than he had being someone of Krios's presentation. That creature of duty and humility had served until he had seen and killed his beautiful Drell woman of sunset eyes. That moment had created the urge to chase desire, and he had done that. That had been satisfying an exertion of power and freedom, but had been unsatisfying for what it lacked in meaning. Excess had not been a temptation that snared him. Seeing the effects of drugs on others, he had been unwilling to try them. He was not fascinated. He was repelled, and did not have to resist an urge to satisfy curiosity. Remote viewing of the endless volunteers, sufficient to the task. Loss of control, inhibition, and dignity was something he was not tempted to experience or incur as an expense. He valued his mind, dignity, and discipline. He did not understand the mind that wished to lose itself in lies. He had created enough lies to know where that path led, know where he wished to go. Regardless of Thane Krios's personality or presentation, regardless of how Beckenstein functioned as a necessity, he as a man had always considered the slaves brought to Beckenstein to be inherently better people than those who held the leash or the collar or the controls. The nuances of slavery and the need to exert power over the powerless was not something that was a mystery. The Hanar had used him because they needed him, not because he was useless. He was a resource. Slaves at least provided something of value. The criminals that populated Beckenstein were nothing but endless hunger in a bloated bubble of ego. Exploration of desire in its iterations had revealed in others and in himself small hungers that fed until they were ravenous beasts, things that tore the mind and reason from the afflicted. All voluntary, self-inflicted, watching the purportedly powerful kill themselves and each other at an accelerated rate to feed those hungers had been educational. Most of the estate owners at Beckenstein, like him, had become powerful in an effort to counteract the inherent helplessness that had invested some part of their lives or some part of their psyches, inherent or created by nature or nurture, or both. Senar's main desire had been freedom. He would always hunger for freedom. That was his endless desire, the thing that was ravenous. Nobody, Cara least of all, could heal that in him, change that small hunger that he had fed until it had become endless. He needed her. He was like the Hanar. She was the resource. He was the consumer. She was the better person. Beholding her twin sons had created the urge to chase an inspired destiny along with meaningful desire, something he was willing to incur as an expense. He had to sacrifice fleeting and temporary freedom for a potential greater freedom, as he had abandoned a temporary and fleeting whim for a greater potential destiny. Rightness was not something he answered to, but she did. He would follow her. He would never trade access to more or less of her for his own freedom. That was the true reason why love was not a temptation for him. She would never trade more or less of him for her own freedom. That was the true reason why hate was not a temptation for her. They were thoughts, concerns, fears, and fleeting images of other worlds, other possibilities. She could imagine Senar without his rapacious hunger for absolute freedom, instead fulfilling a destiny of cooperation and care with the gifts he embodied. He could imagine her, comprehending all he'd done and wanting him for herself, coveting him and giving herself to him as he'd told her he wished her to do in the mirror. In the end, they would play out what began with his hand at her throat and must continue that way, set at the moment her eyes opened. There is want, and there is need, Tralafa. I want you. I need for you to have a control chip until you give me yourself. That is not going to happen. It would not happen. They both knew that. He would have what he needed. He would never have what he wanted unless it was a lie. She would have what she needed. She would never have what she wanted unless it was a lie. He was the only one that would know the difference, and he wondered if he would wake her to show her, tell her, or would allow her to believe she had what she wanted and needed in him. He did not know which was more or less cruel, which was a strength or a weakness, or for whom. There was a word he might have traded with her. I will not speak of love, Cara, if you do not speak of trust. Love might be a temptation to imagine. Trust was something he would never indulge in, any more than he would indulge in drugs. He provided for her to want him, protect him in ways that served her own induced self-interest. But if she were fully lucid, he would never ask to be trusted. He would lose respect for her if she fell so far in intellectual comprehension of circumstances that she considered trusting him or offering trust in exchange for anything else she needed. Her offer of allowing him to turn himself in had been her only concession to that line of reasoning, and it would be the last. She had done that for herself, so she could tell herself she had tried, she had offered. He would never trust her, his whole stolen woman. He knew himself too well, and she knew that as abundant as she was in potential trust or love, as much as she might want to believe the extraordinary in Senar, trust was the word most missing from his lexicon. If love was occasionally bewildering, trust was too well understood to make him think twice or question the concept. Tigran Itran was another iteration of the same man he had always been, whatever his bones or blood held. He kept his craft, he kept his desire, and now he would follow her inspiration. He was pleased, the surrender to fate, a familiar thing. Everything that could be anticipated had been, and had he or she missed something, they would die. Together. At this point, he must preserve her life before his own, if possible. If anyone survived extraction from Beckenstein, it must be her. Not only did that serve Kegeren's purposes, it served Senar's. He would not have her if her need was not fulfilled. She needed to end the Reapers. For him to have wished to escape in a dangerous piece of theater, and to have failed her in execution, would not be something he wished to survive. To be Kegeren, he must follow his impulses to serve, impulses that had never been removed from him, only suppressed, finding nothing worthy to serve other than the path of understanding desire. Through pretending to pray, he found himself praying, one of the odd influences of costume and care and craft. His instincts in these new colors would follow the map they had drawn. He must not be self-serving, It must not reach his eyes or his hands. He must be careful even of his thoughts, of whistling in the dark. Fortunately, he did wish to follow her. That was genuine, not for the motivations ascribed to him, but his actions would be true, unassailable service. Service to freedom, surely. She would see that, hear that, know that. He fought for freedom. Obtaining freedom for others was the only path to freedom for himself in this case. Freedom from reapers, freedom from being killed by them, freedom from being caught by Cara when he could not touch her, when she would not listen. She would never think of it that way. She couldn't. She was blind to that level of selfishness, thankfully. She would create 1,000 other reasons for his motivations because of her priming and the way her mind worked before she would suspect him of ulterior motive. There were a few things he must do that would appear to serve her, things that set up echoes, ripples, and bore fruit later. The one thing he must establish and retain at all costs early on is that he was the only one permitted to touch her, one of a few select medical personnel, including Dr. Shakwas and Miranda Lawson. That would serve his purposes, infuriate the counselor, and create in her a sense of a choice already made. In her mind, buried under all the priming and justification, everyone else's touch would potentially harm her. She would potentially harm them. Gagarin would glow, and she would know she was safe with him. A flourish, and one that was necessary. Pleasure and cruelty folded in on each other and hammered into a cutting edge that severed past from future. He must tell her goodbye. She must ask him to stay. Vicarian would insist upon seeing. Vicarian would perceive Gagarin as the only obstacle to the one thing he wanted. Her. Sooner or later, suspicion would grow, even had Itran been exactly as he appeared. Suspicion would be Vicarian's only potential escape route, his only way to reclaim Bond and defeat the dragon. Cara would hear angels' wings in the beats on the wind, and Vicarian would smell brimstone and imagine a different creature entirely, and they would both be right in their own ways. You wished for my cruelty to be focused upon you, Cara. You should have wished for a crater at Beckenstein and quickly vaporized staff, but you asked me to arrange for them to live. You chose to ask for me to arrange for Vicarian to live. As you wish, Dralafa. Krios had kissed all his frogs, engaged in interviews of his staff, chosen stories and setups. Krios would let them and her go without appearing to want to do so. Krios would have to abandon his estate. Pandora's box had been inspiring in its backward, inexplicably human way. Allowing the staff to live had been inspiring in another way. Vicarian would find himself inspired and upon the path of wrongness, unable to deviate from that path because he would find no other path to follow, and he was a man of forward motion, following the increasingly distant beat of wings only he could hear. You are a good man, counselor, a good and passionate man, and I would pity you if I invested in such things. It is a shame you did not learn to listen to your Ava, as I learned to listen to her. She heard the quiet knock at her door again. Less surprised this time. About the same time of day. About what she might believe was 8 days later if the chip hadn't taken time from her. Always a possibility. Thane had been gone for that time frame, and she had been able to relax. She answered the door again. Dr. Itran. Glowing. She smiled, couldn't help it. She was glad to see him, glad to see anyone who knocked and asked permission to enter. Dr. Itran, it is lovely to see you. Please come in. He bowed his head. Blessings of Arashu upon you, Lyria. My thanks. How can I be of service? I discovered 2 things on my previous visit. Neither are alarming, and both are easily remedied. You lack for vitamin D, and that can be supplemented. You are developing a kidney stone, and I can remove that as a potential risk, aid you in preventing further stones from developing. Thank you for your vigilance. You are welcome, Lyria. Please sit. He indicated the chair again, by the window. She obliged him. Again he spread the blanket and kept his eyes on her face. He took a few long moments and busied himself with the equipment, once again, full of potential. She tried not to think about what she could do with it. Unfortunately, her mind did not really cooperate, and she had visions of that rushing water underground, the approaching moment of her escape. He was glowing, and he had mentioned something hidden. Whoever he was a good omen in the sense that her health mattered, and she was able to speak to someone kind. Something, anything civil, as they both ignored violet ribbons over her breasts. She did not look down any longer, as she once had, to see if her nipples were in view, because they always were, or would be sometime soon as breathing shifted the fabric. He did not look. He began explaining the mechanics of vitamin D, a booster now of supplementation, and addition of a supplement to a diet. It was unlikely the son of Beckenstein would have helped her create D anyway, as it was missing UVB radiation. Forgive me, Lyria. This will be painful, and this will take a moment. He leaned in with a shot intended for her back, his voice at her ear, and the supplement poised at the back of her neck. She closed her eyes, and the anticipated pain was quickly eclipsed by the real and tearing pain of her spine and nerve endings. She didn't react. Not vitamin D. Her chip was being removed. She did not shift her jaw to bite down on anything, didn't tighten her hands, sat limp and quiescent as her spine was opened and torn, the bite deep and radiating down her arms and legs, needles and knives, and the feeling of nerves being yanked out of her whole, leaving empty trails of vibrating cold that filled with heated pain. Something, Medigel likely, spread over the expanding and collapsing sinkhole of suffering. Blood stopped, and the pain was stoppered in her spine like a genie in a bottle, rattling and railing to get out. Commander Shepard, I need your assistance in achieving your escape. I will hand you equipment. Please remove the safeguards on the ultrasound equipment. Augment its output with the components I hand you. We will attempt to break the glass, and then we will need to move together as quickly as possible. I am attaching a probe to your hip. It will remove your tracker. It will tunnel in and tunnel out, and I am afraid I can do nothing for your pain other than minimal local anesthetic the probe will release. His hand slid down, finding her hip under the blanket. The probe a cold and hard intrusion between warm fingers, his venom barely registering because the pain and shock made her hold still, waiting for the equipment. The most important thing, her hip and spine forgotten, collateral damage. The probe began to tunnel, the sensation like a bladed drill. She did not react, could not risk blood from her nose as a result of strain, or from her mouth as a result of biting down. She forced herself to relax, as she had every time Drell hands had been on her before, every time her body had been invaded painfully. Thank you, Dr. Itran. I am lucky to have your service. Is there anything I can do to minimize forming another kidney stone? He drew back, calmly removing the instrumentation from his bag, explaining its function and helpfully suggesting dietary changes that may assist in prevention of stones. Blood trickled down her hip, the hole left open for the return voyage, the right side of her body radiating fireworks of sensation in the wake of nerve damage and perforation. She saw what he intended for the equipment, her mind putting together what he'd suggested. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't stop that, though she tried. The overload of pain and adrenaline made it impossible to manage fine motor control. She tried to look at it curiously and turn it in her hands, accessing controls and insetting smaller pieces from the array he presented her with. The forward motion of the probe stopped, and pressure started. Oh, the tracker was embedded in bone, not muscle. Hip, bone, not the encasing muscle. She couldn't help closing her eyes once and then reopening them, vision blurred as the tearing pressure built, the probe shearing into bone, shards, and granulated shattered bits driven into torn muscle, ground spinning glass deep in her body that needed to be pulled out, sharp edges and calcification ridges dragging along the tract. Should I be drinking more water, or is that a myth? How much water do you drink in a day? She answered, her hands shaking and fumbling, and tunnel vision becoming a problem. She focused on keeping the scream out of her voice and the tremble out of her limbs, sweat making her grip slippery on the ultrasound wand that was quickly becoming an unpredictable hazard to hearing and glass. Hopefully, she might lose her ears anywhere near this thing. In theory, she'd be bleeding from mouth, nose, ears, potentially eyes, hip, and spine by the time they were done. But they would be done. She'd be out. That thought gave her a counter-surge of purpose and steady hands, even though the tunnel vision did not fade, and her mind tried to tell her what that would all feel like on top of what she was already experiencing. She thought she could hear it, as well as feel it, that the sound of her bone shearing would be heard down on the basement security level from here. Her hand clenched on the wand for a moment as the probe finished its job and began backing out, dragging its payload behind it. It felt like it was digging a new tract, was stuck, was unmoving, but that might just be the dilation of time that pain created. Now she waited. She waited to be told what to do. Don't use the wand. Don't grab your hip and press in. Don't look at the blood. Your shore is soaking the blanket. Thank you, Dr. Itran. Hopefully I can put all your good advice into practice. I am certain you can, Lyria. You are a healthy woman and capable of healing much on your own. She handed the wand back to him, slick with sweat, and he examined it critically, his hands steady. The blanket was sodden with blood by her hip. She could feel it. His hand traveled back down the curve of her waist to her hip, his fingers quickly slick with blood. Crucial seconds remaining before the probe pulled out the tracker with attendant bone shards. His hand traveled down further as he leaned in as though to prepare to apply the ultrasound wand. If he did turn that thing on now, it would scramble her insides, and she'd be bleeding from everywhere. His hand retrieved the tracker, pressed it and the probe down into the space between the cushion of the chair and the arm. His hand coming back up applied Medigel as he had to her spine. Another plugged rush of blood and pain. She'd fainted before, when Garrus had carried her off Noveria, and she was afraid it was going to happen again. Right now. She was about to empty her stomach of everything there, empty her mind of screams and go limp, and she couldn't. Is the sun in your eyes? You will need to remain in this position for an extended period of time. Perhaps I should close the shade? Yes, please, if you would. Thank you. He crossed the few steps to the glass, and she watched, fascinated, hanging on the next few seconds. She could hold on for the next few seconds. She had to see if it worked. She had to get out of here. She couldn't leave him to die. She couldn't die here either. She had work to do. He turned and activated the ultrasound, now a feedback screech that vibrated along her spine and ears, more pain in a new layer, cold and vicious and jangling. Nothing happened to the glass, and she was terrified for a moment that they would come this far. She'd be an inexplicably bleeding mess, and he'd be dead. She'd be the cause of it. The sound of the feedback of the overloaded wand meant she didn't hear, but she did see that there was vibration of the thick glass blurring the plane into subtle and then chaotic motion, hairline cracks that widened and bulged and bloomed outward in a destructive burst, some fragments at the outer edges of the hole rushing back into the room from the backlash, shards embedding into his face and the forearm he raised to shield his eyes. He wrapped the curtain around his arm and widened the hole as much as he could, some pieces falling away, but not enough, it seemed. He reached sharp edges of glass that would not give way, and he only had a few seconds to try that, barely enough room to move through. A punch at the edges did nothing. That was it. That was all they had. They had to go. He turned off the wand, the screeching ending, but the ringing continued, and she thought she was bleeding from one nostril, one ear. She couldn't hear anything through one ear, minimal through the other, with this screeching overlay of tinnitus. He picked her up, wrapped her in the blanket, and shoved her through feet first, glass along her back and not her belly, embedded shards dragging along her back, and then she slid down, unable to get purchase on the other side, disoriented, weak, and now on a sharp downturn of the roof, trying to cling to the edge of the windowsill with sweating, cramping hands. He held onto her hand after she'd gone through to give her the opportunity to gain whatever balance she could until she was crouched down in a corner, holding onto the side of the window and not the edge he'd need to clear himself through. He didn't have the same advantage of being lifted and supported through. He grabbed the blanket from the bed and tried to protect himself as much as he could from the shards of glass and slicing edges as he went through. But he was much worse off than she had been. He had had to attempt to jump through as much as he could from the edge of the chair, like a seal through a hoop on fire, the hoop and the edges catching and sinking into the falling weight of his upper thighs. The glass tore at his legs and his feet as he tried to stop forward motion with hands bleeding from trying to bash open the glass. She had no idea how to get down from here. No glowing path, only him glowing, bleeding, determined. She stood from where she was to free his legs from the glass, wind whipping over them, an upgust from the cliff making balance difficult. Her feet were bare, on slippery and curved tile. When he got his bleeding legs under him, she heard the whine of a vehicle overhead, lowering itself down to them. House security, Beckenstein security, or rescue, she had no idea. Only one path forward. Into that vehicle. She heard shots fired, automated turrets activated, and terrifying. A hand was extended from the vehicle, and she was lifted by the doctor, and thrown up and in, and caught. Dr. Itran attempted to leap onto the vehicle, but he missed his aim with another gust of wind, slammed his hip on the edge of the open bay, and slid down until he was holding on with one hand, slippery with blood. Adrenaline in full bloom, she struggled out of whoever's grip was holding her, on her knees because her hip wouldn't hold her, grabbed at his upper arm with both of hers, sweat and slick and slipping, until whoever was on board grabbed at him also, helped to pull him up and bring him inside. And then they were up and off, straight up, the sound of gunfire surrounding them. She dragged him back with her, as far back as she could, didn't let go of glowing Drell Salvation as he slid back with her, the door closing, the shifting weight of the vehicle slamming them back together in a tilted corner. She wanted to stay awake, had to stay awake, slamming adrenaline and rattling gunfire, looking to see if holes were being punched through the vehicle, being punched through him in holes the way the glass had in planes and points. His face held embedded glass and slick trails of green. He caught her before she fell over, his hands on her shoulders so she wouldn't slam her bleeding ear on the grated floor of the ship. And then it went dark. Garrus waited for the call at home, forced to stay on the Citadel because being anywhere near Beckenstein would put him at risk for abduction and interrogation. Gagarin had gone in an hour ago. He hadn't done anything to celebrate or anticipate. He'd sat with his finger hovering over the answer indicator of his Omnitool, moving his eyes from it only enough to check the slowly ticking by time. Spirits, please let it be her. Watch over her. Bring her back to me. Please. When the notification lit, he saw Liara saying, "Garrus, she's safe. It's her. She's on our estate." His heart tore something, and then began to pound. "Get her out of there." "We can't. Not yet. She needs treatment. She's going to be okay, but I had medical crews moved in and activated. She was unconscious when she got there, and Dr. Itran was not in great shape either. He had multiple glass lacerations. So does she, and she needs to be treated at the sites where the tracker and ship were removed. I'm getting status reports, but I waited until they did a rapid DNA test on the blood. It is definitely her." "Do you have pictures?" "No. No broadcasts. Everything's in code. Nothing is being recorded. Her name is not being whispered. She can be evacuated through several methods, and one is a simple shuttle from this estate and out. They weren't pursued." "What?" "They weren't pursued from Krios' estate, and the security of the planet was not scrambled." "Why?" "I don't know, but it's good news. She's lost a lot of blood, but she's going to be okay. Dr. Itran is going to be okay. Some severe lacerations, but he was conscious all through treatment, insisted on it, stayed at her side." "Okay. So that's it? Really? She's safe. It won't be hard to get her back on the Citadel. Escort can meet the shuttle at the jump point if you want." "If I want?" "Sorry. I'm being too polite. Get an escort." "Yeah, that's a better way to put it." "Where's the Normandy?" "She's here at the Citadel." "Okay. I'll call Russ next." "Liara, please say the good part again. The part that it's really her." "It's really her. She's safe. I promise you. Beckenstein will be bound to defend that shuttle out of the system, and we're going to invoke that expense." "What about Krios?" "I don't know. I will watch. It happens occasionally that people abandon their property. Beckenstein has a fig leaf in all the contracts they keep, but in this case, it won't help them. When it is known that Commander Shepard was kept captive..." "Wait, we're telling people?" "I don't know. This is new for me. But I'll give you some what-ifs. If I were Thane Krios and Commander Shepard knew exactly where I lived and she wasn't all that thrilled with me..." "Right. Okay." "He's technically safe, but here's where the legal machine of Beckenstein can grind up an owner of an estate if the planet's management disagrees with an estate owner. Bekenstein's government is not happy when criminals are caught doing whatever they're doing. It makes them look bad. Bekenstein's habitual response to something like this is, "We had no idea such a heinous thing could take place on our soil. We're shocked." Of course it is. It could work for us. If we bring pressure, obvious proof that Commander Shepard was chipped and held against her will, even if it isn't made public but is only brought to Bekenstein's attention, they would want to keep that quiet. They would not side with Krios, who is likely going to cost them quite a lot in security resources and eventually may not be able to afford them because he'd be dead. I kind of wish corporations were just greedy, like Exogeny. They could only take up part of a planet. Well, in this case, it could work for us. I'll watch. I'll see what happens. Once complaints are filed and Krios can't be located, it's possible we could have access to his estate. How? Because it's Bekenstein's only move. They need to look appalled and cooperative, and mostly it's because the rule is that you don't get caught. Krios got caught. There may be honor among thieves sometimes, but in this case, Bekenstein has higher thief credibility to maintain and Krios to cut loose as dead weight. They want their residents to know not to get caught. They also want to know that Commander Shepard is not going to be effective in their direction, and in this case, they're going to probably cave. It's their only sustainable move. Okay, let me know what you need me to do. All right, I'm not saying it's easy. Even with access, it's likely going to involve fees. We might not have been able to buy an estate, but we might be on the hook to rent one temporarily if Krios has abandoned it. Wait, let me check this. Notification from Bekenstein. Local bulletin to interested parties. Thane Krios' estate sustained crippling shutdown of all function. Obligatory attempt to contact him failed. Property considered compromised and abandoned by all legal definitions according to Bekenstein. They'll repeat trying to contact him, but that's a formality. They want him gone. For all I know, they're the ones that cut power and are saying he did it. They want us to know they will make a deal if we move quietly and lucratively. How would Krios shut it down if he's not there? Could he have been there? I don't know. If he was, I'm doubting he is now. My guess would be that security on site informed Krios remotely of her escape, and he wiped out everything that might be able to be discovered by a very pissed-off Commander Shepard if she returned through the front door in the next hour. Good news or bad news, his estate is burned, and he won't return. Bekenstein's administration and Commander Shepard both coming after him for different reasons. She's never going back in through that front door. Well, neither are we. We need proxies again. I'm not signing a contract. Garrus, you are not going. Absolutely not going. She's back. You'd be a liability. We will have teams check it out, but you are not going. I swear I will shoot you myself. I love you too, Liara.